Hi, friends. Today I want to talk to you about the technique of wet on wet. I think when you can master this, it's going to really give you so much more confidence in your paintings. It's going to make you feel like you have a little bit more control, although wet on wet, you can kind of predict a little bit. The beauty and the magic of it is it creates these beautiful mixes of color and beautiful effects that you can't always achieve intentionally. So we're just going to go through a few tips and tricks, I suppose. And I use predominantly wet in wet. Of course, I have to originally start with wet on dry, but with my flowers, with my leaves, I'm constantly going in and adding, wet paint into wet paint to get these beautiful blends and soft mixes of color. So I really, play with this technique a lot because especially if you're painting flowers, it's a beautiful, beautiful technique to get comfortable with, and it will take your painting to another level. So let's just start. Have your 2 cups of water, one to wash, one to rinse. And that's going to save you from having these muddy colors. And then I've already sprayed with water my paints, and I'm using my 140-pound Arches watercolor, which I love, cold press. I wanted the paints to move nicely so you could get a really good idea. So wet on wet, wet on dry, they're both really important key components to watercolors, gifts, and each of them has their own kind of special uses and qualities. They both provide different results depending on what you want. So wet on wet just means you're taking wet paint onto wet paint or wet paper, either one. And wet on dry means what it implies. It's just wet paint going onto dry paper. So let me just show you. Wet on dry is going to produce really crisp, clear lines, vibrant color. So exactly, even you can tell here, exactly where I'm putting my brush is where my paint's going. Really sharp edges, no bleeding. So that is your wet on dry. It's very deliberate. You have a lot of control, sharp edges, more detail. Now I'm going to wash my brush. I'm going to rinse it, dab it off just a tiny bit. Now I'm going to wet a small area with water. You might not be able to see this. And I'm going to go into this area, this wet area, with wet paint. So you will see the difference. Number one, wet into wet can tend to be a lot softer, I've noticed, in color. The other thing is it's much more kind of dreamy, kind of loose edges. The color can be much lighter. So, it's a completely different technique. Now, the one thing is, if you're using wet in wet, the paint is only going to go as far as the water goes. So it's only going to go to the edges and then stop where my water stops. But it can be a very beautiful technique, very soft, very, to me, very natural. Now, there's, of course, always a reason to use this when you want some defined shapes. When I'm painting and I want to get a leaf that really pops out, I'm going to go wet on dry. When I'm trying to get kind of a dreamy leaf, one that's kind of in the background, I'm going to use this wet technique. Let me just show you that. So let's create a leaf here. I'm going to start with point, press, point, press. Okay, so this leaf is very watery. It's very light. And it's not wet on wet, but you can see how it's got this light consistency. Now I might go into that with a little bit of brown or something like that around the edges. This is wet on wet. So you get this very dreamy blend of colors. Now wet on dry, but a darker value is, let me show you, is going to be, oops, so that was a little too dry. So as you can see, this leaf really pops out. Now I can still go wet into the wet leaf and get this blend, but that value and wet on dry used darker, which is more value, would be more paint than water. Look how that leaf pops out. So to me, whenever I'm using any type of wet on wet, it really tends to kind of fall more in the background versus the foreground, just keeping that in mind. So the other thing that is interesting is, let's go into this. Wet is only going to go where wet is. So if the paint is not wet that you're going into with more wet paint, it's not going to spread like this. It's only going to go where the water is at. So you can somewhat control it if you know this leaf is all wet, then you know that paint is only going to spread where that is. So it's not going to go outside of this line because there's no water. Watercolors, wet paint goes towards water. It's always going to be following water, okay? So again, the wet on dry, you're going to have those hard edges. The paint, the watercolors are not going to flow beyond those dry edges. It's going to help you keep those forms that you're creating unless you're pushing or pulling the paint around with some more water. And what I mean by that is if you were to, let's do this. So here is a leaf. Now say I want that leaf to be a little bit softer on the edges. I want that paint to blend a little bit more. I'm simply going to wet my brush, not fully wet, and I'm going to touch the tip. And what that does is it just pulls that paint, gives it this beautiful soft edge. Now I use this a lot with my flowers. You can even kind of keep playing with that and just pulling that paint. Okay, so look at how beautiful. Now let's just play with going, while this is still wet, into the bottom here with this blue. And look at how beautiful that is. See there? So at any time, if you feel like you've got kind of a rough edge, just go up to it with the tip of your brush with a little bit of water. Okay, now another technique that you can use is kind of creating this variegated, graduated blend of color. So if you have which is a little bit of what I did here. So let's create that leaf again. Let me get some water on my brush here. And we're going to create more wet in wet, which is really what I seem to be focusing more on today, because that's the technique that I love. So point, press, point, press. Now let's go into this on the other side with some yellow paint, which is Cad Yellow from Winsor Newton. That was sap green. So pretty wet. And I'm going to go right up to the edge of this. Point, press. So as you see here, where it was wet on wet, it's got this beautiful blend. Where it's the wet on dry, it's got a pretty well-defined shape. So let's just go into this again with a little bit of blue, which I love putting in my leaves. Just tapping in there. So now you've got this beautiful blend. Now you don't want puddles. Remember, when we're painting with watercolors, got a drip here, your layers of paint, if you notice, I'm not creating a big giant puddle. You don't want puddles, because then you're going to get a very odd distribution of paint. So let's do this. Here's a petal. Now it's got a beautiful sheen to it, right? It's kind of shiny. I can move all of the watercolor around. This is wet on dry. It's got this beautiful sheen to it, but no puddles. So if I go into that, I don't want to create a puddle, so I want to rinse my brush, just scrape it a little. That was actually my wash water, by the way. And then let's go into this again, not with a dripping brush, but with that tea-like consistency. And try this again. So just dabbing along the edges. Now, if this was dry, I would not be able to get this. Maybe kind of pulling down. If you want, you can pull that paint. Okay, so I'm getting this beautiful blend of green and yellow. Now let's go in again with that blue, because that shows up a little bit better. Or let's use some brown. I actually really like putting a little brown or burnt umber, which has some beautiful orangey tones underneath. Let's just go into the edges. Isn't that lovely? And then creating this branch, which you can also go into with some green, wet and wet, letting it blend. And if you want this to blend some more, you just kind of pull it very lightly with your tip, and you can drag it and help it to move. Now, you don't want to go into it too much, because then it will turn to mud, because you're just mixing the colors. So you just want to be taking the tip of your brush and gently moving it, okay? So another part of using wet into wet could be if you want to do layers. So say I decided, let's say I'm painting this leaf. Let me get it in there. In watercolors, you always want to start with a light hue and build to darker, unless I'm intentionally creating a dark leaf with darker value, meaning more paint to water, because I want that leaf to pop out. But here's another. If you start with this very light, notice it's shiny and glistening, but I have no puddles in there, okay? It's just shiny. Now I'm going to paint a flower petal next to it using my favorite color. Let's do this petal, okay? Like so. I'm rinsing my brush a tiny bit so I get this lighter value. Okay. So now what I might do here, let me just finish, is while this is wet, I'm taking more pigment on my brush and I'm tapping in. Look at that. So I do that all the time on my paintings. Let me go a little bit darker so you can see that. And this creates so much fun. Okay, so that is really what I love about wet on wet. Now, once this dries, say this was a leaf, and I just want to highlight or create a shadow on part of the leaf, what I could do is take a tiny bit of my Payne's Gray, very light and watery, and I'm just going to create a shadow here. Okay. So see how that darkened? Now, if that was on a leaf, that could be a beautiful shadow. We could create a shadow on here by layering, and layering is key in watercolors. So I've just created this beautiful shadow across this leaf, like so. Now, if I wanted to create a highlight, I could maybe go into this with some yellow, and that creates a different color. And what's fun about layering, now layering is going to be, can you guess, wet on dry versus wet on wet, which is here and here. Let me show you another example. While this is wet, I always create my stems while my flowers are wet, because I want to get that beautiful blend with my flowers. Now I'm going to add some orange, or I'm sorry, some brown burnt sienna to that. Look at how beautiful. So you get that blend. Okay, so wet on wet here to create this beautiful blending. You can use wet on dry, as I did in these two, to create this shadow. Let me see if my pen works here. So this is a shadow. This could be a highlight. And this is definitely just a blending. This is wet on wet. And so is this. Now, as soon as this dries, I'm going to show you how sometimes I will put wet on dry paint to get some of the leaves to pop out in front. So right now this is wet on wet. No puddling, just shiny. Let's see if I can go in. I believe this is dry, and I want to put a leaf over this. So wet on dry, I'm going to do here, and watch. Let me get some green paint here. I'm using quite heavy, so more paint to water. Pretty fully loaded brush. And watch when I go over the wet on dry. I'm not going to get this nice fuzzy, blurry, dreamy effect. Wet on dry. Okay. So now that leaf looks like it's really popped out in front of this one. Number one, because I put it on top and it's barely showing, but also let's do it with this one, and I won't go over the top. It's darker in value, so it looks closer. So let's see, point, press. There we go. Let me add a little bit more paint. Point, press. So this leaf seems to be in front of this one. Now you can use the whole technique, washing my brush by the way, and rinsing, scraping on the edge of my water to create that depth in your painting and to have the dark and the light values, and then also to put the darker values over the lighter ones, and using wet on dry, otherwise this would just all blend together, is going to create that beautiful interest in your paintings. Now this is pretty dry. Let me go into this with a darker value of this same Quin Magenta. So I'm going to have more paint on my brush versus water. And watch. Point, press. Point, press, point, press. So what that just did, look at how beautiful that is. What that just did is it made these flower petals look like they were out in front. Now this was a little bit wet, so it's blurring a little bit, but you know what? I'm okay with that. I'm actually going to go in and create this leaf again, or stem. So I do this quite often in my flowers because, as you can see, the lightness of these petals in the back look very dimensional. It looks like they're in the back. Then once this dries, you're going to go wet on dry. Make sure this is dry, otherwise you're going to get a blend. And go in with a darker value of your paint, the same paint, but you're using more paint to water, and add some leaves here. I think I'll add one more here. Let's see here. So I'm using some pretty thick paint. So let's just paint, press. There you go. Look at that. Now let's play with some leaves with this. So we're going to start with wet on dry. And I'm going to go a lighter value, okay? So I want this leaf to be in the background. Point, press. I've got my two C curves, point, press, C curve, point, press, the other C curve. Okay, so this leaf is lighter. Now let's do another one on the other side. maybe a little different value, point, press, point, press. Okay, so this one's just a little bit darker. So that might look a little bit closer. And then let's go in for the really dark one. So more paint to less water. And this is going to give you the example of foreground, kind of midground. And then we're going to go in for a darker color, which like these really brings it into the front there, the foreground. So let me get a real dark version, which is a lot of paint. Really loading my brush with that paint. And let's do a leaf here. Now I'm also overlapping. Point, press, two seekers, point, press. Okay, look at that. Now how beautiful is this flower? Just all I did was play with the values of my paint and that push, pull, push, pull. So these are in the back. These are in the front. I did wet on wet to get this beautiful little blending of some colors. Now I could go into this because it's still wet and just add maybe some little touches of yellow. Now I know that's hard to see because it's so dark. So I'm going into wet. Look at that. Isn't that beautiful? Just that blending. So you've got a lot of dimension and interest to this painting, which is literally all the same shapes. I'm just using different values. I used wet on wet here to blend. Let's see if we can add some blue in there. I don't know if you'll be able to see that. Let's try. There you go. And you're getting that beautiful wet on wet blending as you did here. And then in the back, it's just wet on dry, crisp edges. Here you're getting blending, the wet on wet. So I hope this is giving you an idea of how to use some of this wet on wet, wet on dry. Always remembering to go first with your lighter colors and then building and adding. Now, if I wanted to darken this green, I decided, you know, I want this to be a little darker in hue. You can go over it with another layer of watercolor. And that makes it a little bit darker. You can never go backwards. You can't lighten it. Okay, so you always want to kind of plan and start lighter with your petals and things. You can always go darker. So I hope this helps you. Again, I'm using my number 8 Princeton. It's just my favorite go-to brush. It is linked in my description. My 140-pound Arches paper, which I absolutely love. You all keep asking me about my little palette. She's on Instagram, Mist Ceramics. If you reach out to her, I can certainly put the link in there to her Etsy account. And I think that's it. Grab your little free booklet I'm offering. It goes over a lot of these techniques and brush strokes. And as you can see here, look at how beautiful these color, wet and wet, wet on dry. Here's some wet on wet. These are layers. And this push-pull, using more paint, less water, is going to pop out your leaves, pop out your petals, which will take your paintings to a whole different level right off the bat. but really play with the wet on wet technique, because when you can get comfortable with using that, it's such a beautiful touch to your paintings, making sure when you go wet and wet, you're not dripping into it. You just play with that amount of water that gives you the beautiful sheen that we want, okay? The wet on dry, of course, is going to give you the crisp shapes and colors. So I think that's it. I hope I was able to bring you some value with this video. If you have any questions, please ask. I'm loving your requests for different flowers. I think our next one will be foxglove, which is really fun. And meanwhile, all my supplies I link in my description, and I will see you all soon. Thank you so much for being here while I learn this whole YouTube, and I hope I'm bringing you some value and inspiring you to pick up your brushes and paint with me. Okay? All right, friends, we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.